couldn't teach his earlier class, so I'll have a recording he can send them. But yeah, what we're looking at with political philosophy is always kind of the underlying assumptions of all politics. Even the most mundane aspects of politics, elections and parties and all that, has everything to do with what we say justice is, what we say the purpose of government is. And so, as you can tell, there's a real transition that occurs between Aristotle and Plato on one hand, and then Machiavelli. Machiavelli really marks the birth of modernity in so many ways. And I'm sure you talked about what that means, but hey, Liam, how are you? Yeah, no worries. Here we are in more advanced modernity with Thomas Hobbes, and it advances even more after that. These really are, as you read them, keep in mind, these are the architects of modern consciousness. I mean, these are the people who have shaped the way we think, not just about politics, but about everything in so many profound ways. And in some ways, too, they stand as an obstruction to the pre-modern way of thinking. It's why Plato is hard to understand and Aristotle is hard to understand. It's really because we think in their terms. And I hope you can see the contrast. So reading Plato is more a matter of liberating ourselves from modern assumptions. When you study these guys, it's like studying the bars of the cage, that we're all in, that we're all part of. So yeah, what's different? And what's the difference in the classical and the modern way? And the medieval way is kind of in between there, but it's closer to classical than it is to modern. But yeah, what's the difference? What was the major concern of Plato and Aristotle about people and what made people flourish? What was it? A well-ordered soul in the Republic and all that.
What is justice?
Yeah, right. Justice, and justice understood as a virtue, right? The four cardinal virtues, right? Justice is one, as well as moderation, courage, and wisdom. Wisdom was the highest. And those things were the habits that make us realize what we're meant for. We have this clear purpose to us. And that's what happiness is, right? And happiness is like a highest end. And everything we do and everything we desire aims at that end. That's the whole ancient way, right? The modern way is totally different, as you can tell. What is it? I mean, Machiavelli has that one really famous line where he says, "Don't talk about how people ought to be." That's Plato, right? Yeah. Talk about how people are. Let's be real here, right? So Machiavelli is gritty, and so too is Hobbes, as you can tell. It's about the sort of, you might say, very negative, but still realistic, down-to-earth understanding of what motivates the human person. And human flourishing is not understood as the highest end of virtue. It's understood instead as what? Assertion of power, or in the case of Hobbes, it's comfort and security, right? It's lower, baser things than the lofty idea of virtue and happiness. What else is different? There's one major institutional change, right? Plato and Aristotle were talking entirely about, what was the political unit they were focused on? In fact, it's the title of Plato's book. Republic, yeah. Although that's sort of the Latinized version of the polis or the polity, right? So you're right, it is republic, but republic really meaning just the polis. And what is a polis? It's a city, right? Like Athens, like Sparta, like Rome. And that was the highest political unit. Even though you had these vast empires in the ancient world, the city was still understood as the more fundamental unit. Empires were just a collection of cities. What's different with modernity? Now you have not a city, but a state. Yeah, that's really important. Bad translations of Aristotle and Plato will replace the word city for state. Don't ever, those are terrible translations. I don't think the ones he assigned did that. I know Alan Bloom didn't in the Republic. He's very careful to say, no, polis is different. It's not a state. Sometimes translators will say city-state, but no, with Hobbes, it's the state. That's what the Leviathan ultimately is. Yeah.
Are there any policies around today that we can point to?
Yeah, good question. Is the polis still with us? Yeah.
I don't know how much what you say is the state of the city, but like Vatican City is also just a city.
Yeah. It's interesting the way that, I mean, the way like the city still is, I think in a lot of ways, the fundamental political unit, that we do politics best in a sort of face-to-face community, like a city council, a township, a town hall meeting, something like that. And the amazing thing about the American political system, right, is the fact that it sort of does both. Like we are a state, We're very much a Hobbesian Leviathan. But at the same time, we're made up of all these little communities, right? All across the country. And they're not just political either. They're religious communities. That's basically what every church is, right? Every church congregation anyway. Social clubs and bowling leagues, and we just do it all. We have all these very polis-like activities that stay with us, even though we have a big federal constitution and a big nation with a border and citizens with passports and all the stuff that Hobbes talks about, and a big powerful federal law that we fear and respect. There isn't a Leviathan necessarily, that's different about him, but still the idea of the state is we've got one in the United States, even though we have little polises. If you read Alexis de Tocqueville, he points that out as his French visitor in the 1830s. So yeah, what else is different? Here's an interesting question. Between Hobbes and Plato, who's more optimistic and who's more pessimistic?
It would be more optimistic.
Yeah, Plato is, I think you could say, in a cosmic sense. And Plato is more attuned to beauty and truth and wisdom, right? Yeah, he seems a lot more optimistic. Hobbes is cranky and people are bad. But then again, if you think about their goals, Plato, did he really have much hope that we'd have any kind of good republics ever? Will there ever be end to trouble in the cities? Are kings ever going to listen to the philosophers? No. Will philosophers ever be kings? No way. So for that reason, Plato was actually more pessimistic. He was optimistic in the universe sense, but not in the political sense. Hobbes flips that around. So even though he sounds very cranky and negative, the possibilities are much broader because he sort of lowers your expectations, right? So if we just assume that people are going to be self-serving, you'll never be disappointed when they do bad things. So yeah, it's sort of yes and no, depends on what aspect of them you're talking about. So yeah, it's an interesting question to consider between these two. So I believe we're talking about chapter 13 through 20, is that right? He sent me a syllabus, I couldn't find it, but
Yes.
13 through 17
Yeah.
for today. And I'll be here Wednesday. I think that's 17 through 20, is that right? Or should we just wing it? Yeah, so far what has Hobbes said? He has he divides the whole book into 4 big sections, and each one has a bunch of chapters. Part 1 is man, right? And in general, what does he say a human being is? And it's an interesting theme. Like, you've got to get the person right to get the politics right. And you design government based on what human nature actually is. And in a way, he's kind of similar to Plato in that respect, right? What is the state? It's an artificial man, right? Just like a just soul is a city in the soul. It's a similar line of thinking. But yeah, what is a human being? Long section. Is very tedious. It's okay if you didn't get it all. I confess I've never really understood a lot of it, but in general, what describes us best? Do we have innate ideas like Plato proposed? Yeah.
I could be wrong, but just from the first part, he says we're all equal.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know if they're really easy to find definitely.
Well, by chapter 13, right, he starts off with equality. And that's important. Hobbes is the first political philosopher to say, no, we are all equal by nature, right? So as cranky and negative as he sounds, that's kind of good news, isn't it? Right? And it's certainly attuned to our democratic sensibilities in America. But in the earlier chapters, like chapter 1 through, yeah, we'll get to that. That's really important. But he's an empiricist, meaning everything we know comes from our impressions and our senses. There are no innate ideas, right? So if you never had any sensations, you wouldn't have any thoughts. So we're sensory creatures. We have what's called a train of imagination. We take impressions of things and we construct them in our minds. So what's a unicorn, right? It's a mix of a horse and a horn or something. What's a Pegasus? It's, and so we have this sort of creative ability to do that. We make stuff up though a lot. We have a lot of delusions. What perpetuates a lot of the delusions in his time? What's the one institution he really despises?
Religious institution.
Yeah, yeah, especially Catholicism. That's right. He really doesn't like Catholicism because it's above the state. And that's much of the history of Catholicism, is the struggle to say, no, the church is not going to be subordinate to the state. They're distinct, right? And it came up because of, kings and nobles trying to appoint bishops and priests. So yeah, he really doesn't like Catholicism for that reason. Closely tied to Catholicism is the universities. They keep teaching Aristotle. They keep teaching that human beings live for an end and a purpose and virtue, and that politics is natural, as Aristotle taught. Remember all that? He really hates that idea. So yeah, it's a long, tedious section. Good job slogging through it. But what does he say in chapter 11 that's so important? I mean, here he takes direct aim at Aristotle. You guys already read it, but it's worth pointing out. Yeah.
What do you think he'd say the fact that we're reading him, but also still reading
Yeah.
Aristotle and Plato? Do you think he would be ticked off?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You'd say you should just read my books.
Yeah.
So, he actually said that at several points. My Leviathan is the final and ultimate book on political philosophy. And yeah, who's his audience? Like, who's he writing for? I mean, Plato just wrote for philosophers, right? Machiavelli wrote for the Lorenzo Medici of Florence, right? Who's Hobbes writing for? In fact, he has a dedicatory letter.
Mr. Sidney Godolphin?
Yeah, Godolphin was a friend of his. And he says, too, in other places, that my hope is that Godolphin and others will get kings to read this and their chief advisors. So really, it's a book trying to prop up monarchy, but not on the basis of divine right. God ordains kings, but on the basis of science. So in some ways, he's very enlightened and progressive. In other ways, he's very traditional. But yeah, what did he say in chapter 11 that's so important? There is no summum bonum, or highest end. Right? So when Aristotle says everything acts for an end or a purpose, no, it doesn't. There is desire upon desire that ceases only in death. Right? My page numbers are different here, but you see it in the first couple paragraphs somewhere there. That's tremendous, right? Because right there, he just takes direct aim at the ancient way and denies it and rejects it, just like Machiavelli did, right? People talk about cities that have never existed. He means the Republic that you guys read. No, I talk about cities as they actually are, right? So Hobbes has much the same idea. Yeah, what's religion for Hobbes? You mentioned religion a minute ago. You looked at that in chapter 12. I'm just reviewing here, but
it's what we like, what humans could do, what we cannot explain.
Yeah.
Like the answer to what we cannot explain.
yeah, that's right. It sort of fills in the gaps, right, of science, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, Hobbes himself was pretty much an atheist, but still he saw the value of religion. Specifically for what, though? In giving people hope. No, for the state. And that's why the Leviathan on the cover of the book, right? The frontispiece you probably talked about. That's why he has the scepter as well as the sword. The sword is the state. The scepter is the church. No church should be superior to the state. Yeah.
And he's always talking about the contract with the sovereign and then how that gets you to heaven. So that's important to him.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, his kingdom of God, right, is not heaven or heaven and earth becoming one, as Christian teaching. His kingdom of God is the state. Yeah, and that's really huge. That salvation and God's intentions for religion really is to facilitate this sort of heavenly kingdom of God, and that the king is instituted by God. I mean, doesn't Romans 13 say that? That all political powers are instituted by God. Let everyone be subject to them. Paul says. Hobbes says, well, yeah, that's it exactly. God implements them to usher in His kingdom. Right. Of course, Paul didn't say that exactly, but that's what Hobbes says. So yeah, chapter 13 then. All that said, this is the most famous chapter of the Leviathan that gets taught everywhere. Nature has made men so equal in faculty of body and mind that even though there is one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or quicker of mind than another, when all is reckoned together, the differences between people is not so considerable as that one man can claim to himself any benefit that another may also claim. Right? So how unequal are we really? Where do our inequalities come from? They're just incidental. They're just made up usually. Sure, maybe somebody's stronger than another. But then again, the strong man goes walking by a cliff somewhere and the weak man up top sees a rock. And what does he do? Yeah, we're equal there. So someone might be smarter and quicker and cleverer, but if the weak all work together, they can outsmart the smartest. So yeah, human equality is square one. And again, that's kind of like, oh yeah, maybe Hobbes isn't so bad, right? Although keep in mind what kind of equality he means. Equality of rights? No, our equal ability to kill each other. That's the basic equality he's looking at. As to the faculties of mind, he says, he talks about like secret machination and confederacy, right? He talks about like the weak and the weak ganging up on the strong. But yeah, as to faculties of mind and the arts grounded on words and especially skill from general and infallible rules, that is science, he's all about science, are set aside. Very few have it, since it is not a native faculty with which we are born, nor is it attained while we do something else. Even those who have this art typically have it only in a few things. Right? So yeah, not everybody can think scientifically, but it is knowledge available to everyone. And once you grasp it, you realize it delivers certain truths that are universally applicable. Right. Philosophy doesn't normally do that. For Plato, he really only wrote for the people who could understand him. For Hobbes, though, science, especially the argument of this book, can be made generally understandable, which is hard to believe as you read it. You go, why did he say that? But yeah.
Which is interesting how like Plato writes and people who understand his books are considered like he would consider a little more enlightened.
Yeah.
Whereas Hobbes writes for everyone, but basically says a bunch you aren't going to get. Like, well, a bunch of this doesn't really like you're not as special. Like it's
right.
It's like I don't know. It's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, it's odd. But then he would turn around and say, however, once public officials read my book and grasp it, the lesson that they can give to the people is broadly understandable, especially chapter 13. So all the Enlightenment stuff, the first few chapters are pretty dense, as you saw, but chapter 13 is really straightforward. I don't know if you ever considered writing a compendium of this book as a popular pamphlet, like Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, the Hobbesian Manifesto. But certainly public officials could disseminate these basic lessons to society, and he'll lay out certain principles that he thinks are crystal clear and even the most uneducated can grasp and appreciate. So yeah, what else does he say about this equality? I consider faculties of mind. I find greater equality among men than strength. Prudence. What is that? The highest cardinal virtue? Well, it's just experience, which equal time bestows on all men, right? Everybody figures it out eventually. And there are certain things that prudence shows are absolutely and undeniably true. Everybody likes to think they are, wiser than the many, don't they? What's that famous survey? 90% of Americans think that they're smarter than the average American, or something like that. But there are certain things that really are universally understandable and that the state can disseminate and everyone can see. And what are they? Well, consider, though we are all equal, that also means that we desire the same things. And it's not hard to understand what other human beings need because you just look in yourself, right? Shelter, food, companionship, safety, security, right? Isn't that what we all basically need deep down? At the same time, what causes conflict? I'm sorry, you had something.
No, I was gonna say, like, it's like interesting when he talks about how like we always are the same thing, but that in turn like creates like defiance between each other, or like no two men can have like enjoy the same thing. So that's what creates enemies.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, basic economic scarcity comes from our common realization that we all need the same basic things. But as a result, right, you get diffidence, as he called it. And it's not just so much like you're going to grab what I want, or you've grabbed what I want. It's more that you might do it. It's more the fear that I might run out of food, that my security might be breached and someone will harm me, that it's fear of what might happen. Incidentally, what did Hobbes translate? Did he mention this? He translated Thucydides in the History of the Peloponnesian War. And if you read that book, right, Thucydides says, why did the Greeks go to war with each other, the Spartans and the Athenians? Because of fear, right? Not so much because of what one did to the other, but what they thought they might do. The Greek word is phobos. We get our word phobia, right? So he applies a lot of the same lessons of Thucydides to this book to construct his state. Fear that someone else might take what you want when you need it. Fear that you might go hungry or be assaulted or whatever. That's what makes conflicts happen between people. Does this mean that people are naturally political? As Aristotle said in the Politics you saw, the city exists by nature. No, cities exist because we make them up. What is by nature? It's this place he calls the state of nature, right? And here we have the modern social contract. And what is it like? He doesn't use that phrase till later, but there's this competition. Yeah. So what leads to human conflicts inevitably in the natural world? Until we have some power to overawe them all. He uses that phrase a lot, right? When there's no power overawing us all, what are we doing? We're all fearful and suspicious of each other, aren't we? You might take what I want, right? You might grab the last apple off the tree when I'm hungry. So it's this rough, rugged kind of condition where everybody lives in constant fear of each other and there's violence. We find three principal causes of quarrel: competition, second, diffidence, third, glory. So competition is scarcity, diffidence is anticipation, glory is just cruelty, the desire to be mean to somebody else. The first makes us invade for gain, the second for safety, the third for reputation. So, brutal place everybody lives in prior to there being government, the state. What do you call it? It says in the next paragraph, hereby it is manifest. Yeah, someone read that one.
Hereby is manifest that during the time men live, that a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition, which is called war.
Yeah, right.
And such war as is of every man against every man.
Yeah, good. Every man against every man. So it's not like armies on a battlefield kind of war. What is it? It's every individual, fearful and suspicious of every other individual. Sometimes they'll form groups, right? The weak to smash the strong, but then what happens? Yeah, right. They turn on each other. So nobody, what is the basis of people trusting each other at all? No matter how much you think you can trust someone, can you really trust them 100%? No, they'll turn on you. As soon as there's one apple left on the tree, your best friend is going to murder you for it, right? That's Hobbes. That's the Hobbesian world. And we calculate this all the time, don't we? Where does trust come from? Well, it's when we have a common power to keep us all in awe. In other words, we only trust each other because there's a government that will punish wrongdoers. Take that away and all the trust disappears, doesn't it? Isn't this the stuff of like sci-fi, post-apocalyptic films and books? What comes to mind? Like The Walking Dead.
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies, exactly. Lord of the Flies is very much a Hobbesian book. Yeah, when you again, take away government and the system and all that and put a bunch of little kids on an island, what do? They'll be murdering each other. So yeah, Lord of the Flies is very inspired by Hobbes. And there's always that struggle, right, to try to create a state again, the order, the conch, remember? And you got to protect Piggy because he's weak, and you got to turn to the wise Simon as opposed to the crazy Jack, and
That's a Locke part of it.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, Locke has a lot to say about this too. Are you guys reading Locke later? I think you are. Okay. Yeah, see, Locke is a more humane version of a nicer version of Hobbes. But yeah, I mean, it's the stuff of novels and post-apocalyptic fantasy. And so yeah, this famous paragraph: whatever therefore is consequent to time of war, where every man is the enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time when men live without security, other than that which their own strength and invention shall furnish them. In such conditions, there is no place for industry, because the fruit of it is uncertain, right? You could work really hard to collect a bunch of apples off the tree or shoot deer or whatever, but somebody's going to steal it. Somebody's going to kill you and walk away with it, right? So why bother? There's no navigation, right? Maps or knowing your way around. There's just wild, rugged wilderness, scary and dangerous. There's no commodious living, right? Think about how nice it is to be in your house at night, especially when there's weird noises outside. Aren't you glad there's a nice thick wall between you and whatever that is? Commodious living, buildings, he means. No instruments of moving or removing things that require much force. The tree falls across the pathway. Well, who's going to remove it? It's just going to sit there. No knowledge of the face of the earth. No account of time. Right? What does time even mean, prior to government? Just nothing. No arts, no letters, no society. And which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of, what is the fundamental human motivation? Aspiration to the good? No, what is it? Yeah. Death, right? Or specifically, danger of violent death. That's universal. Every single human being, no matter how uneducated, can appreciate that, can't they?
I mean, I feel like that was a thing in Plato too, because there was somebody, I forget who it was, said like, people only do the right thing because they know they're gonna die eventually, and so they're just afraid of what happens after that death, even though it's not like the same exact thing, it's sort of a similar thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Because you're like scared of that you're gonna die, and
Mhm.
what's gonna happen when you die, so you might as well do good things.
Yeah, back to Cephalus, right, at the beginning. And by the end, too, there's like a last judgment kind of scene in book 10. Before Christianity, Plato had a sense of the last judgment. Yeah, I mean, Plato, he's not really the opposite of Hobbes. He kind of encircles Hobbes's points in some ways. He is very much the opposite of Aristotle. Aristotle and Hobbes are quite different. Yeah, sorry.
So he's saying that if you take away all of our structure and like governance, that like men will just like turn back to like their like brutish in nature sort of.
Yeah.
And there won't be any reason to like live. Is that why people always say that Hobbes is like says like humans are like naturally like bad? Like, isn't that what people say about him?
Yeah, that's a good question. Does he think people are bad necessarily?
Or
I mean, Machiavelli did, right? But does Hobbes really say that?
I wouldn't say it feels like they're actually. I mean, I feel like he thinks that there's just no way in which, like, without structure, they will be able to thrive.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily something bad. I just think he thinks that's just what, like, will inevitably happen.
That's right. I think that's important. He's just realistic.
Yeah.
He even says that in the chapter. You can say, this is a terrible thing to say about human beings, but we all know it's true. Just look at yourself, right? He said that at the very beginning, right? You can read books or you can read yourself and see how my book shows you your fear of violent death, your desire for security, right? That's what makes everything else possible, right? So without government, and we've had attempts at government. What does he think of the ancient city? It was a nice attempt, but it was basically frail. We have, modern states and republics and monarchies. Those are also nice attempts, but they're also weak. What I'm calling for is a super state that will actually fulfill what people really desire for that security. Because, right, we all know that under the surface of it is chaos and misery and the war of all against all. It isn't really a historical thing either for Hobbes. It's important to keep in mind. And as you read Locke too, it's the same point. It's not like we started off in this horrible state of nature and then we grew civilization and got better. No, it's more like it's this vertical thing. The state of nature is always there, lurking under the surface of everything. You feel it when you drive across the desert in the middle of the night, when you're on a hike somewhere in the mountains and realize how far away you are from help. When you think of all kinds of circumstances, it's always with us, right? There's always that slight shade of distrust for other people. And the only reason we trust at all for Hobbes is it's not because of human relationships or friendships or love. It's because of government. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's
yeah, I was just curious because I know like Google like is Hobbes like like it will say like he thinks humans are not naturally or like they are naturally like bad, but I don't know. I don't know if that was true.
Right. And for Machiavelli, it's like they're bad in the sense that they'll go against their conscience.
Yeah.
Right. And for the prince, you got to do that.
Yeah.
But for Hobbes, it's more like people you can call it bad, but he said earlier, what is good and bad? It's just whatever I like or don't like. It's all a matter of taste, right? It's subjective. So to say that people say what I'm saying is bad, that's not the point. It's predictable, right?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's what he's going for is like a firm foundation for his state in predictable behavior. So someone might object. He entertains an objection here. It may seem strange to say this about people, right? To some who have not well weighed these things, and that nature should thus dissociate and render men apt to invade and destroy one another, right? But hey, look at yourself, he says. When taking a journey, don't you travel with a gun, right? Or at least a dagger, and well accompanied, go with your friends, safety in numbers. When you go to sleep, don't you lock your door? Why do you do that? Even though there are laws, there's law enforcement, the state's going to protect you. You still arm yourself. You still guard yourself a little bit. Hobbes would be a big Second Amendment guy, right? He'd also advocate for home security and Simply Safe and all these like cameras and surveillance, When even in his house, he locks his chests. And when he knows there are laws and armed public officers to revenge all injustices done to them, he still takes these precautions. What opinion has he of his fellow subjects when he rides armed, of his fellow citizens when he locks his doors? What about his own children and servants, maybe even his own wife, when he locks his chests? Right? Even family members don't trust each other naturally. That's pretty bad. Does he not there as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do by my words? What a line. Don't you accuse yourself by what you do, is what I'm saying here. The desire and other passions of men are in themselves, back to your question, no sin. There's nothing wrong with you if you think this way, if you don't trust anyone, if you view humankind as fundamentally self-interested. It's scientific to look at man this way. There's no sin in it, right? No more are the actions that proceed from the passions until they know a law that forbids them, which until laws are made, they cannot know, nor can any law be made until they have agreed upon the person who shall make it. Another objection, what else does he say? This one's interesting. Yeah, what's the next objection he entertains? It's kind of what Plato did with his dialogue, right? Back and forth. Hobbes said, well, someone else might say, what's objection 2? It might be thought. See that paragraph? Sorry, I should have adjusted my page numbers. Was there ever a state of nature? Was there ever such a time when people were in this condition of war? Hobbes says, it's not a point in time, I just said it a minute ago. It's always there. So it's not so much a point in time we left in the past that you can describe history that way. Westward expansion in the US, maybe. But that's not really his point. It's what?
It's always there.
It's always there, yeah. It's always lurking under the surface of every law, of every time you're just a little bit out of the protection of law enforcement, you feel it. You know what Hobbes means, the fear, right? Can't wait till we get to that next truck stop. Can't wait till I get off this mountain. Just, you never know. But there are many places where people live that way now. In one place in particular, what does he say? America, the early explorers in North America, right? The savage people in many places of America, except for the government of small families, of course, being, Native American tribes. You'll see Locke say the same thing about America too, but in a very different way. But yeah, it's just constant civil war. And it just, without government, people just are fearful and suspicious and they fight. And it's like that, not within states that are strong, but between states. There's a great description of foreign affairs. Though there has never been any time in which a particular men are in condition of war against another, we always live under governments, true. But in all times, kings and persons of sovereign authority, because of their independence, because there's no higher power. Now, the Catholic Church tries to mediate, but it's not really as effective as it should be. What are they like? Gladiators, right? Their weapons pointing and their eyes fixed on each other. That is, forts, garrisons, and guns upon their frontiers and their kingdoms, and continual spies on their neighbors, which is a posture of war, right? No treaty, no executive agreement is ever complete. There's always distrust. So there's no justice outside the civil community, right? In the state of nature, justice means nothing. You have no grounds to complain about anything. The only reason we have a sense of justice or trust or society or any of these things that Aristotle thought were so natural, as you saw, is because of government. So how do we get there? How do we make government fulfill these things better? Yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, I was just gonna say, then would he be in support of like a global leader?
Yeah, good question. I don't think he thought on a global scale so much. And it was always,
Would he be like, it seems like he, like, we were talking last class about, like, he hated war so much and he hated conflict with
Yeah.
people. So in that sense, I feel like he would want one leader to rule every existing people.
Yeah, it sounds that way. That's true. I think what he means, like the worst kind of war for him is civil war, internal strife. And he has reason to say that because what did he live through? The English Civil War you guys talked about, right? Watching the country tear itself apart between these factions and mobs and the anarchy and all the misery and suffering heaped on the people of England because of their own civil war and the failure of their king to hold it together. Right? That's what he's concerned about. Wars between states. Yeah, he doesn't like that either. But then again, if the state is strong enough, it'll deter any kind of foreign aggressor. Yeah, he didn't think in terms of internationalism so much. And he's much more on the realist side of things in international affairs. Whereas later, Woodrow Wilson and Immanuel Kant and those figures, they look more to international law, international treaties, and then the globalism that emerges later. Although it's interesting what really drives globalism today. It's not political organizations so much as what? Coca-Cola and Apple. It's the market. It's capitalism. You'll talk about that when you look at John Locke later. But no, for him, right, there was no global perspective at all in his view. It was always going to be states. But he did seem to think, and the way he describes this, right, this is transferable anywhere, right? It doesn't depend on culture or society. It depends entirely on every person recognizing their fear of violent death. And that spans across cultures, or so he thought, right? You can apply this in any continent, in any race, in any customer culture. His state will work anywhere. So back to your point, there is that global perspective. This is exportable. It can be exported all over the world. And indeed it has. Just look at a map of the world today. What do you see? It's a colorful patchwork of countries, each with its own sovereignty, each with its own capital city, its government, and its passports and citizenship and everything. It's, it works. But as far as global governance, no, he didn't really see that. I was supposed to get to chapter 17. How am I doing? 13 is really important. It's worth meditating on that carefully. But here it goes a little bit faster. He lists things. So whatever we don't get through today, we'll finish on Wednesday up through chapter 20, I believe. So yeah, chapter 14, how do we do this? How do we make sure we create a state for the right reasons? Scraping away all of our delusions about human ends and human purpose and virtue and happiness and all that kind of stuff and natural human union and everything. Let's construct the Leviathan state. Here's where it starts. What is liberty, first of all? He's actually big on liberty, which is surprising. Yeah, that's quite different from Plato and Aristotle. What was liberty for them? Freedom from your own passions, right? People could be free in terms of their rights, but then again, they could be completely enslaved to their own desires, right? Hobbes doesn't see it that way. No, liberty is getting everything you want and nothing you don't want. Absence of external impediments, right? So whatever you desire, all the impediments are out of the way. That's a very modern idea of liberty, isn't it? What is the law of nature? The lex naturalis in Latin. This is quite different from classic natural law of Thomas Aquinas or Cicero. It's a precept or a general rule found out by reason by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life or takes away the means of preserving it. Notice his life, not anybody else's. The most fundamental precept of the law of nature is avoid violent death. You do it without even thinking about it, right? The raging bull comes running at you. Do you stop and think, should I step out of the bull's way? No, you run, right? There it is. Just think about that mortal fear. When someone points a deadly weapon at you, what do you contemplate the situation? No, you give them what they want, right? There it is, Hobbes says. That's the law of nature proving itself again and again. So yeah, we preserve ourselves. Now, as we see with Locke, he goes a step further and says, don't just preserve yourself, preserve human life in general, right? But that's Locke. For Hobbes, it's preserve yourself. Save your own skin at all costs, right? So that law and use and lex, use is the Latin word for right, lex for law, ought to be distinguished because right consists in the liberty to do or to forbear, whereas law determines and binds to one of them. So that law and right differ as much as obligation and liberty, which in one and the same matter are inconsistent, right? So law and right, they're different, right? Law is constructed. Right stands alone. Right is natural, or at least the right to preserve yourself at all costs. So to rephrase the state of nature again, what does he say? This war of all against all, it's continual, it's perpetual, it's miserable. And again, it's always with us, right? You might think you trust your neighbor or your friend, but when the lights go out, right, you find out just how fake all of that really is. It follows that in such a condition, every man has a right to everything, including one another's body. That's terrifying, but that's what he really means, right? That the use and abuse of each other in the state of nature. Therefore, as long as this natural right of every man endures, to everything endures, there can be no security to anybody. We're all vulnerable. So for that reason, so first and fundamental precept of natural law is what? Preserve yourself. Avoid violent death, and you just do it impulsively. But then we build on that, and here's how he builds the Leviathan state with the secondary precepts. What's the first of the secondary precepts? For the rest of this section, he lists things, but yeah, what's the second? Yeah, endeavor peace. As a general rule, we ought to endeavor peace, seek it. Now notice when he says that, it's not, he says ought, but what he really means is it's what we really want. Nobody likes the state of nature, right? We want to come screaming out of it into the arms of the state, don't we, that will protect us. It's like, the yard duty and the bullies and the wimpy kid. It's like you really see where Hobbes is getting at here. Second is trickier, and he spends the rest of the chapter trying to explain the second one, and we might pick up with this next time. But yeah, how do you seek peace? What's the first thing that has to happen?
You could defend yourself.
In the state of nature, you do, yeah. But once you decide to seek peace, what does that mean? Right? You've got your weapons and I've got mine. Okay, we're going to seek peace together, right? You agree? Yes. Okay. All right. You put your guns down first. No, you put it down first. No, you. Right? Because what's the danger? No guns, I guess. There's no industry, but put down your spear first, right? No, you. How do you know that if you put down your weapons and we agree to peace, that the other guy's not going to turn around and kill you? That's what he's trying to figure out for the rest of the chapter. What is it that ensures that everybody will step out of the state of war into the state of peace and start building a state that will protect us all? Let's we're done at 110, right? Yeah, let's adjourn there and we'll pick up with that. And like I said, it does go faster, so I'll get up through chapter 20. I promise we'll get up through chapter 20 next time. So I'll see you Wednesday. Go seek peace and avoid war, and I'll see you all next time. Good class, guys. Good to see you again.